This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant-sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, doctoral students and everyone in between, culture workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Courtney Terry, Assistant Professor of Black Studies at Portland State University in Portland, Oregon, where she teaches and writes on the history of and resonance between literary and popular cultural figures around questions of race, class, and expressive life. She also serves as Director of Education for the Hip Hop Museum in Bronx, New York. In this conversation, we discuss the place of popular cultural studies in the field, the echoes of forms of Blackness across African American history, and how an interrogation of cultural production expands the living archive of Black studies. Hello, Courtney. Welcome to the Black Studies Podcast. It's great to have you here. How are you doing today?
Thank you for having me. I am well.
Well, I'm really excited to talk to you today. Reading a little bit about your work, and we were just chatting and knowing your interests and your background in terms of your studies. I just think it's really important perspective, really important voice to have on this podcast. And so I really appreciate you making the time and really looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you all. I saw on Instagram that you all had started this podcast early on. And I immediately clicked follow, like, oh, these are my people. And so I've been following and been listening to some of my other colleagues from different schools and like, okay. And then I got an email. So it was just like, oh, this I've seen. So after a few correspondences with you, I was like, the answer is yes, I have time.
Excellent. Well, I'm glad you do. So I'm looking forward to talking with you and hearing about your work and how you imagine the field of Black studies. But I thought actually before getting into those particular questions, I just want to start off by asking you to narrate this in a more personal way. Sort of narrate how you came to Black studies, how you came to the study of Black life. So what drew you to this place? What keeps you committed? What sustains you in this kind of work?
What a great question. Thank you for that. I would say I've always been a precarious child. So two things. I've always been a precarious child, and I always knew I was going to be a doctor. However, for the first part of my life, I thought I was going to be a medical doctor. So I was really attuned to
I love that.
Trying to be literally trying to be an emergency and all the terms. I went to a medical magnet high school in Los Angeles. King Drew, and I thought I was in. However, it was my struggles as a kid growing up in South Central, to single parent, and just not having the kind of academic support that I needed to push over into earning the medical degree, right? As I saw, right? Because when you're in a medical magnet high school, everybody wants to be a doctor. It's not competitive. It's the standard, and the standard is high. And although I met the standard, it was just arduous. And I had a math teacher, Miss Casher say, you can still be a doctor. And I looked at
a different order.
Right. And I said, oh, you're right. And so in that way, she freed me to what the folks say nowadays, do a side quest and really engage in Black literature and film and theater. And luckily, I grew up in a home where literacy was key. My mother always had books for us and always had a magazine subscription, Reader's Digest, Time, Essence, Jet. And so we grew up in a literate household where reading was just what we all did. Mm-hmm. And so in that, I got a chance to read as a child, Dick Gregory, the work of J. California Cooper, a fiction writer, Toni Morrison, and Du Bois, Langston Hughes, right? So I got this kind of education at home that really helped me to sustain the transition out of this idea of Courtney being a medical doctor, right? And being reared in South Central, where you, in post riots, Los Angeles, where the disparities were just so visible. You could see the disparity in healthcare and the disparity in wealth. Uh, I like to tell people some of these universities we love so much are literally in the ghetto, and and one of them is USC. I spent some time as a young student on the campus of USC, taking certain classes and learning to navigate university life very early. But it's situated in a very urban area, and that's when I realized the ability to be able to exist in both the campus and community was a total, it was a factor that I needed to explore in order to be successful coming from where I was coming from. And so after high school, I was able to go, we just mentioned this, to Humboldt State University, the northernmost CSU in the CSU system in California, right? That whole spiel. And being a city kid, a total city kid, buses, trains, helicopters, ice cream trucks, right? Just a loud place to go and have education in such a serene, beautiful space on the land of those native nations, right? Just to be welcome there and to get the kind of education that I got, I feel lucky, right? Very lucky, because there's so many colleges in Los Angeles that I could have attended. And for some reason, I chose to go all the way out there. But it, it turned me into the scholar, right? It really helped me get some rocks in my pocket to read further into Black literature, Black life, Black experiences, both here, in Mexico, throughout the diaspora, right? And also to be a meticulous thinker, right? When you have the time away from all of the noise of the city, both actual noise and, social noise, it turned me into, it really helped me develop my mind for Black studies and my lifestyle for Black studies, which is weird because it's such a white place. It's like very white, very white. So even just with that, being in the Pacific Northwest, about almost 1,000 miles away from Los Angeles, but still earnestly trying with myself and my colleagues to be seen as Black and know that that was 100% okay.
So let me ask you about how you imagine the field of Black studies. I think that if somebody was to plot a sort of journey to Black studies, Humboldt State, it'd probably take a while for somebody to get that as a location. But that itself is like a really interesting. I'm sure you have a lot more to say about sort of that moment and what came after. But when you think about Black studies, I mean, you're in one of those departments. It's been part of your graduate training as well. I'm interested to hear how you imagine the field, and I'm framing this really in terms of the origins of Black studies as an area study, as an academic institution, which had those two competing moments, right? It was the moment of, look, these disciplines like English, history, sociology, et cetera, they don't study Black life. Right. And the demand that Black life have a place on campuses, have a place in the curriculum, have a place to be studied, developed, the intellectual tradition appreciated and researched. But there was also, of course, in that moment, the relationship to the politics of community, right? Because it also was taking place when militant Black liberation struggle was at the university doorstep, so to speak, in Northern California in particular, but also across the country. So there's that political demand, but there's also the intellectual tradition demand of like developing ideas, developing disciplines, and so forth. And I'm curious, it's been 50 plus years since this origin point, but I think it's still a question for us as Black studies teachers and scholars, like, how do we imagine the field in relation to those two things, the development of an intellectual tradition and the development of political imperatives and political intervention?
That's such a great question. And I think I have two answers, or maybe it's just one answer that's two-sided, perhaps. I think that in the next 50 years, well, let me go back. What really strikes me about Black studies and what I research, right, is essentially Black life worlds, right? I'm very interested in how Black folks live their life, and particularly this use of tricksterism, right? This use of how Black people surpass boundaries, circumvent boundaries, and really make the impossible happen. And so when I think about the origins of Black studies, like you said, with the Black Power movement and activism at the university door, demanding to be seen and to be heard. What I see is these Black folks living these lives, having these experiences, and literally coming up short, right, in these other fields of study, history, English, traditional fields, as we would say, right? And saying, hey, it's a value statement of the boundaries, of the limits of the imagination of the folks who made these curriculums. And so when I think about the next 50 years of Black studies, I think we have to reassess the beginning, right? To go back and welcome these activists, welcome the community back to our campuses. And I know I'm not bashing any program, right? I know each program is different and regionalism is important, right? So how Black studies looks in Cleveland may be a little different than how it looks in Southern California. And I think that that's one of our specialty points, is that we can zero in on a particular Black population, get the pulse of the need of the people there and also the students there. I think in using tricksterism, it was so funny. I'll tell a little story. I don't want to be tangential. However, during undergrad,
got the time.
Right? During undergrad, I was at Humboldt State University, and a lot of people get reawakened to how the world works during college, right? During the university experience. So you're just jolted. I don't want to say culture shock, because I'm not shocked by anything that humans do. I'm shocked by some of the things they don't do. So I was like, oh, wow, you didn't see that? That's crazy. So I think that, again, I'm shocked by what folks don't do. And when we think of the universe, my tangential story, I'm sorry. I was at Humboldt State University and very into Black studies, into ethnic studies, into racial equity and justice, right? Both on the campus and in the local community. And we had the opportunity to bring in some performers, right? Rap performers. I don't know if I can say their name or if you can edit them out.
It's your choice.
Right. The hip hop group.
Okay.
Right. Which we know that these hip hop acts and poets and authors, visit universities. So I had a hand in welcoming those folks to the university.
That's a great get, by the way. That's not like, I thought you were it was going to be some random person. It's like, no, you pulled somebody out of the canon. That's great.
Yeah. So
good work.
You're right. Definitely. And using the university's grant money and being in a club and really understanding the process of how, it doesn't say we can't bring Dead Prez to the campus. So let's see if they answer our emails and if we can work something out. And we were able to work something out. And so he asked a question similarly. We asked a question similarly of M1. He said, how do you get more of us, in on Black studies and on BSU? Just throw a party. And we looked at her, and he looked at us back at her, throw a party. Feed them, give them some music, meet them at their cultural point. Don't trap them, definitely throw a party. And then halfway through the party, cut that music off. And be like, well, I got you, everybody. Have we heard about the new sheriff that's trying to do this? Have we heard about the new superintendent that's trying to do this? Make it to where our community feels comfortable. Our community feels like they have buy-in at this university experience, even though they're not a student. Or make it to where our students who are from around the world have buy-in in this community that they're spending almost 4 years in, 4 years or more in. Right. And so it was profound to hear it, but I can say since I've heard it like a decade ago, it's been true. It's been true. And I don't have any qualms about that. Um, because people have to feel comfortable around intellectualism. I think because we exist in the West, there is certain anti-intellectual rhetoric that's around being a young Black person, being a young urban Black person, being a young, all of these, things are counted against. I identify as a late millennial. I don't identify as Gen Z. So all of these things that we've inherited from our older generations that repudiate us, that we're worried about if we're respectable for traditions that we never set up, right? But I think the party, the cultural atmosphere lends itself to this political tricksterism, to this educational tricksterism, where we can have these conversations guised under a party, guised under a conference, guised under these things, and still do the work. I'm not discounting the work. I do understand rigor is love, and we would not have these disciplines, Black studies, ethnic studies, women's studies, queer studies, without folks doing the rigorous work, that which means mastering those other canons so much so that they can see all of the fissures where Black folks don't exist, where Black disabled folks don't exist, right? So I do believe that we should match our study energy with our energy in welcoming the community to the campus and finding ways for the community to foster our intellectual endeavors at the university, right?
So that phrase, rigor is love, by the way, my students are about to get real sick of that. I love that.
It's love.
I will give you, if it's your phrase, I will give you credit for it, and they'll all know your name. I love that. I mean, I think that's a really important thing, and every student could use that kind of imperative and reminder, but also affective relation, because there's real content to that, like you said. But when you're talking about both this sense of relation to community, like if that's an imperative of Black studies, I really like that this pullback of that being discussed at a general level, and that's something that we have to think about site specific, that here in the DC area is going to be very different than in the Portland area where you are, and that it's not a good, bad, it's just a different. And how do we attune ourselves in that way as responsible scholars? Because we attune ourselves to texts all the time. If I'm going to talk about Frederick Douglass, I don't talk about Frederick Douglass in the same way that I talk about Christina Sharp, because they're from different eras. And so we do that with text, and they have different kind of writing and rhetorical structures, et cetera. But it's interesting for me to reflect. I was reflecting as you were talking about, I don't know how often I don't want to speak for other people, apply that same rule to those senses of what even the question of community means. But we ought to.
I think we ought to. Again, we can't. It's up to us as folks who do this research, as folks who hone this expertise, to never forget about the folks who don't have access, about the folks who don't want access, but who are very much affected by what goes on in this local university space, right? By the future politicians who graduate from this space, right? I always like to listen to where politicians got their education, right? So it lets me know, for 4 years or 6 years or however many years you spent there, the kind of community that you had access to, whether or not one took advantage or not, or whether or not that campus community at the time had the resources, the time, the bandwidth to be able to welcome the community, right? That all matters. And without saying any names, it totally matters, the political lineage we find ourselves in, because like I mentioned, a moment ago, USC is in the hood. University of Southern California, it is in the ghetto where I am from. However, they maintain a stronghold in the local community, both visually, aesthetically, and with their population. And so there's so many inroads into how they work with the community and how the community struggles with their presence. right? And so, I don't have a degree from that institution, nor have I never taught there. However, being a citizen reared in California, also South Central, I can see some of the effects
Yeah.
of this, and they're undeniable. And as a scholar, I know some of what I see locally is intrinsically tied to what goes on in those buildings. And I'm certain the majority of the community that's affected by what goes on aren't invited to those meetings. And so there's that.
And I really love the anecdote about, not the anecdote, but the throw a party, and then while I have you here, I mean, I mean, this is just my teaching semester, but I'm teaching a class on Angela Davis, and it's so much of her autobiography has these kinds of moments in it where she's in jail, and she's that they know who she is, and they chant "Free Angela," and she's like, no, free all political prisoners, free all of us, and that sense of sort of a solidarity party opens up the moment where I think it's famous. Well, it's famous in my mind and in my classes. Then that one of the people in the jail, one of the women says, Angela, what is imperialism? And that opens up this whole, they become basically a political education group. Not because Angela Davis came in there, with her PhD and decided to condescend to the masses, but because they had, I mean, in jail, you're not having a party, but had a version of that, which is this sense of celebration, of community building and making together. And then there's that moment of opening. And she's like, well, this person doesn't know how to read, so they don't know how to read about imperialism. And so she's like, we can talk about it, but I can also teach you how to read. I'm going to teach you how to read, not with Cat in the Hat. She teaches how to read they read Vladimir Lenin on imperialism and revolution. But thinking about those moments of celebration and education, I really love that as a way of thinking about, about the question of community, not as missionary work, but also not as distance, right? Because there's intimacy at parties. I mean, people sweat, they yell, they sing, they drink. Yeah.
And I think each culture has their version of what I just said, right? So not necessarily a party, a teach-in, a matote, a powwow, right? All of these places where there's cultural exchange and a leveling, I don't want to say a leveling of the playing field, but a meeting of community members outside of these titles, right? Without the condescending titles, and what they could potentially let someone know about your access, right? So titles are important, right? You need to know the sheriff from the deputy. Titles are important. However, in the community building, I think that folks who do the work use their titles as verbs. Like if I'm doctor, you're going to see me doctoring. If I'm pastor, you're going to see me pastoring. You're not going to
I like that.
see me separate from that. And if I'm a lawyer, you're going to see me working with the community here and also doing my campus research publication obligations, right? They're not separate. And so that's what drew me to Black Studies, is this we're going to work with all of us. It is up to all of us to teach all of us to do what we can do. And we use the institution as a tool to move us how we need to move for the best.
Let me shift a little bit and ask you about your own research and interests. I know your work is this mix of literary studies, cultural studies, and of course, popular musical culture. And, this mixture just has so much potential to generate insights, new and old and future oriented around the question of Black life and its meaning. So I'm curious, in thinking about your own research and interests, how do you see that your work in relation to the history of the field? Like, how do you situate it to the past of Black studies, and how do you see it opening up new horizons in the field?
Thank you for saying that. Well, asking that. So the title of the dissertation is The Rap of Black Folks, right? And so it takes this, it signifies on Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folks. And what I found in doing that research is, yes, it's for the field, it's for the discipline. However, I'm doing more than saying, rap music, hip hop culture is this African thing, right? I try to specify a lineage of where we get the ideas of genre from, the ideas of culture from. And what I found is that it predates the discipline itself, right? But it also lends itself as a tool to create the discipline. This idea of, again, ancient tricksterism, where traditional Africans of different nations had these deities, these trickster gods that they both acted as, they lamented to, they, dispersed through proselyte, through preaching and through missionary work. Edit that out, not missionary work, but through cultural exchange, right, yes, among other Africans and things like that. And so when I think about this idea of transmuting knowledges in order to work particularly for your culture, work particularly for your nation and people, and once I came to understand that as a student at Clark, my world just opened because I could see the ways that we used circumvention, the way that we used language in order to double speak and to speak again and to say yes when we mean no, and how that's a use of power in certain situations, right? I think of Literary Characters by Charles Chestnut. I think of, you mentioned Frederick Douglass earlier, and Frederick Douglass, whom I love, has these instances in his own autobiographies where he's shape-shifting, right? He's using all of these attributes of what we would consider a trickster in order to get free, maintain his freedom, in order to learn to read, right? Because we say he was self-taught, but in the self-teaching, he understood the trick before he understood the words on the page. He understood he had to deceive those young white boys, or he had to trick them into saying, hey, you don't know how to spell that word faster than I can. And they, of course, during that time, rattled off the word correctly. And he's like, yes. Right. And doing this kind of learning, but there's also exchange where he already understands he's taking this knowledge for himself, but also back to who he can help. Right. And then he does the helping work. He does the work. And so when I think about my own research, and I'll just lay it out. So the dissertation covered the year 2000 and the number one singles from the number one albums, rap albums of that year, of solo artists. And so what I was looking for were manifestations of traditional African tricksters within those singles from those artists. Right. So 2000, pivotal year, in my opinion, understudied, particularly from an Africana point of view, right? I think there's lots of, magazine articles, which were helpful as research, right? A lot more commercial, texts available than academic texts at the time, and even now, right? And so when I think of the year 2000, another trickster moment where the genre is shifting, our sound is shifting, our technology is shifting, and it is the community of folks, particularly in hip hop, who push this moment over into success. And I think a way, again, that's understudied. And so the year 2000, we think of some of our favorites, right? And some folks who are no longer with us. We think of DMX. Jay-Z had a wonderful year. Lil' Kim had a wonderful year that year. Black Rob, Big Pun. And so, again, I only research solo artists. And so, of course, we leave out folks like Bone Thugs and Harmony and Outkast, who undeniably, left their mark.
Mm-hmm.
And because it was a study specifically of Black artists and the rhetorical tradition of tricksterism used in their lyrics, and also tricksterism used throughout their rap career at that moment, right? So there's commentary about the album covers, particularly if we think of the album cover of Lil' Kim, right? The pink Baroque walls with the silk, and she's with the low rise jeans, and the hands over her chest, right? And the hair. And and so, some of these aesthetic signifiers that also extend this life of tricksterism, like you think you're looking at one thing, but you're also looking at another thing, and how that hybrid culture transmutes in this 2000 moment.
Mm-hmm.
And I got inspired to do that work through reading literature, both fiction and nonfiction, by Black folks. I think of a particular text, which reminds me of our conversation today, the WPA narratives.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So this moment in time where folks thought it was so important to reach out and to go do this journalistic work to speak to the descendants of the enslaved and some folks who had survived enslavement to get their stories. And then I think about the Sterling Stuckey study afterwards. I believe it's Sterling Stuckey, who went back and, looked over some of those narratives for some of the misrepresentations because the interviewers were white, the misrepresentations because the interviewer may have been male or female, right? Or some of the inconsistencies with language that we now know, oh, that's how folks talk in Southern Florida versus Southern Georgia, right? But if the interviewer is, from Southern Georgia, they're going to hear it through this filter. And so even with that, going on the record, hearing the rhetorical circumvention, even in the telling of the life story, is fascinating to me, right?
Yeah.
It's so fascinating, which is, why I love rap music, because we want to think that these rappers are telling their life story, or we want to think that they're a great storyteller. But some of them are so masterful at the art that it just leaves us in this state of which I like to call new mythology, this new legend making that I think that we're in, because we can do some of this, people say code switching, we can do some of this professional code switching, language circumvention. We can do some of it now in a way that is a little less policed than it was perhaps in the past.
And I love, I'm really interested in cultural studies generally, but it's just interesting to hear you talk about your own work and how cultural studies, you're trying to, I don't want to say de-link, but not limit the sort of study of cultural production to its moment, but actually see in these cultural productions, right? These singles, these covers, so
Exactly.
all elements of the art form, the inheritance of decades and generations of practices. And I think that sense of, it's funny because I think like scholars do that with like jazz and blues, right? They always pull it back, but it's always, I talk about this regularly. It's like, well, at some point that was contemporary music, right?
Exactly.
And so maybe we should think about our own contemporary cultural products or productions, in their longer history. And that can be hard to do because at the moment, it's hard to get outside of both fandom, which I think is great when it orients research. I'm not actually negative about that. I mean, I wrote a book on James Baldwin because I'm a fan of James Baldwin, but still, the way we take, inheritance seriously as soon as it's 50 years old, right? I love hearing you talk about doing that. I was going to say about something very recent, but that was 24 years ago. We're a different generation. This is a little traumatic for me, but nevertheless, I mean, 2000 has a kind of still presence. I mean, when you were talking about those covers and those songs, I think like even my own children, my 13-year-old knows a lot of those songs and covers. So I really appreciate it. I like that way
That's
of like
good.
pushing the horizons in terms of the field, in terms of the kinds of objects of study, but also linking to that tradition in Black studies of doing this full cultural, milieu of signification that's across time rather than simply in its moment. So you got to make that a book and get that out ASAP.
Hey, listen, are you listening, everyone? I got to make that a book and get that out. Publishers, let's do it. And so, more to your point as well, there's a text that I love to teach from, and it's by Dr. Rabaka, and he's the head of the CU Boulder Black Studies Center, and he has a text called Hip Hop's Amnesia and Hip Hop's Inheritance. And he lays it out. It's very well researched. And again, being a fan, but also being a researcher in this academic as well, really acknowledging that, hey, in this cultural moment, if you are a member of the hip hop culture, you have inherited some things.
Yeah.
And it's jazz, it's blues, it's samba, it's all of these other genres. It's the sound, it's the aesthetic, it's the literal grandchildren of some of these people, right? I wouldn't dare call them Nepo babies because, again, rigor is love. And I think that all of these folks work really hard to distribute their art to us, right? And for it to be a part of the canon now, right? I think about that and what that looks like. And so I am seeking to not have as much amnesia as maybe scholars have had in the past when it comes to speaking about particularly African-American Black cultural productions, right? We've got a short memory, and I think social media lends itself to that short attention span and that short memory and this kind of detective agency work that some folks do as fans and as researchers, and the line gets very cloudy sometimes. Like, is this person a fan or
an
investigator or instigator? Right? What is their link? But to me, when I hear some of these journalists and influencers / journalists, I'm not sure what the title is. When I hear some of this, my link back is, how are they speaking about Black folks? Right? Okay, have a critique. How are you speaking about Black folks? Because one can have a critique and totally dehumanize the subject and the genre, and I'm not with that. Have your critique, and everybody should be able to meet up again and have a conversation about the art and the process and the method. And I think that's what Black Studies is good at as well. For it to be less than, a century old, I think we have a great mechanism by which we self-critique. But I also understand that to be something that comes out of traditional Africa, something that traveled with us on the Middle Passage, this idea of solution-oriented, democratic community work that works for the best. Works for the most of us most of the time.
Yeah, I love that. And I just anecdotal, one of my colleagues, Marissa Parham, I remember she was revising this essay for a collection, and it was on contemporary social media, mostly Twitter. And it had all this stuff on Ellison and the lower frequencies. And she kept getting this feedback, like, why is there all this stuff on Ellison? You're supposed to be talking about Twitter. And it was just this moment. It was like, well, that's these signifying practices, right? And Ellison didn't invent this idea, right? Ellison is giving testimony to this. I mean, Invisible Man is one long testimony to lower frequencies, tricksterism, and variations. And it was that moment. I mean, she was able to hold her ground on it and publish it. But I think that kind of work is so necessary, but also, that's what Black Studies produces, right? And I don't know that other forms of study are as attentive to that question of inheritance. Yeah. And thinking about your research, also, because, just already your characterization sort of led me to this. I mean, I'm wondering, your PhD was an English, African American studies sort of hybrid. You did both BA and MA work in ethnic studies, African American studies. Like, how for you has that changed the way you do scholarship, or not really changed, but how has that opened you to a certain kind of scholarly life, but also your classroom? Because like none of that is disciplines. None of it is that sort of, you really don't have a background other than the English department element of your PhD that would cut you off from that kind of deep study of inheritance, that deep study of repeated traditions.
So point of information. So the PhD is in humanities with concentrations in English literature and African American studies. So
gotcha. Thank you.
No worries. So Clark Atlanta University and Panther Pride. And so I was there earning my master's, and I did the master's work on, and don't ask to read it, on Nas, right?
No master's stuff I think should ever be read. No master's thesis should ever be read.
Keep it in the dark. So it was on Nas's, the rapper, his rise to fame, right? As far as having these A&R elements, as well as having this immense skill set, this immense set of peers, right? We think about who his peers are at the time of, Illmatic. He's in the pantheon, absolutely. And so using some of the journalistic sources that were available at the time, Source Magazine, Vibe Magazine, rap pages, also the texts that had been written about his life and a few documentaries, and really sourcing together his life world and what it took to become, right, this early person that we know as Nas, right? And the kind of tricks that needed to be done and were maneuverable at the time. And so what I love about the degree that I have is that, and also shout out to Dr. Victor Osanubi, who started the program, earning the PhD in humanities with concentrations in English and African American studies at an HBCU. Mm-hmm. That's the most rigorous and loving experience I've had in my life. So that's why I can say with just unflinchingly, rigor is love. I was taught to teach in all three disciplines. So I have graduate units in all three disciplines, and the majority of my colleagues do as well. So again, it lends itself to what are boundaries? What are these boundaries that I can push as an Africana scholar trained at HBCU? What kind of classrooms can I now have access to? So yes, I didn't take the traditional route, right? I took a non-traditional route, so to speak. But now I have this access with this knowledge that I can be in a humanities class, graduate and undergraduate level, and I can be in an English class, graduate and undergraduate level, and an Africana Black Studies class, graduate and undergraduate level. And that's the investment for me. That's the ultimate crossroads experience in being able to synthesize knowledge for a variety of different kinds of students in a variety of different kinds of disciplines and maintain an Africana center, right? And I'll leave it at that. So
I love that. I mean, I think I think most Black Studies departments have this conversation regularly about, what does it mean to hire people in disciplines, and what does it mean to hire people with Black Studies PhDs, or in your case, humanities PhD with areas of emphasis. So I appreciate you clarifying that, because that is its own, like it's not a Black Studies PhD as an African American Studies department, but it also shares all of those things with Africana Studies PhDs. And it really changes the idea of what a classroom is. And when you talk about your ease in moving across these kind of different languages and different ways of reckoning with materials, I mean, I think of somebody like me trained in a discipline, how much work it was post PhD to learn how to do that. Mm-hmm. So the idea that that's your entry into teaching and writing is just, it's a whole, that's why I ask, because it is people have such different journeys into that anti-disciplinary or multidisciplinary, however one wants to characterize it. But it absolutely transforms scholarship and also classrooms. I mean, I've taught in a couple of departments of Black Studies, and it's always a struggle. You know, how do people who are trained in disciplines stay responsible to what the field actually is? And there are other people like you. It's like, well, I'm trained in the field, so it's not an adjustment. It's a reflection of what I did and how I was trained. I never liked training as a way of talking about graduate school, but I kind of slip into that language, right?
Yeah, I do as well, right? Because you think about some of the processes that you learn that you still use. So that's what I think about training. I don't think about all the spiral outs, what I learned from those. But also, this idea of transmuting Africana studies, Africana methods and methodologies, and seeing how they could enhance a more traditional discipline. So I kind of lean away from saying interdisciplinary, because I always think sometimes it's a one-way street again, where it's a larger traditional discipline realizing that rigor is love, that Black studies scholars do the work in a way that perhaps other fields don't do. And it's always a reckoning, oh, well, we can, do how they do for a season and see what we yield, when really a lot
do
of
what
us
they do for a season. Oh, that's a painful way to put it, but it's so true. Sorry.
Yeah, if you've been in it as a professional, you're like, oh, we're just everybody's excited, we do a thing, and then it just kind of dissipates. And those of us in Africana studies, Black studies, we think about our students, we think about some of the access and resources that may be lost if we don't transmute some of these methodologies and use our expertise to invite others to the field and to the research of the field, right? Because I don't want no fair weather scholars just, again, interested for a season.
Yeah.
And that's the only reason. So it's a hard road to toe. And again, the legitimacy of the field is always being questioned by traditional lists. And so with that, I think that also sharpens our colleagues' research abilities. Mm-hmm. I think it sharpens our minds. It sharpens our conversations about the discipline so that we can have informed conversations among ourselves, intradisciplinary, and also with our scholars across and other schools. It's I am clear that we are a class of scholars who constantly do the work, who are constantly trying to figure out how to keep up with our communities, but also maintain a space in the university that's safe, inviting, welcoming, research-based, rigor-based.
So when you think back on the history of Black studies, what do you think that it's done particularly well? And also, what do you think it has not done particularly well? I mean, it is a field, populated by human beings. And so, we don't always do everything well. But what do you think Black studies has done well historically? And what do you think it hasn't done so well?
What Black studies has done well, I think the large majority of us to ignite that, that interest in learning, in the academic experience, unlike other disciplines, right? And I'm not talking about a Disneyland experience, selling an experience. I think because the majority of our colleagues are so earnest in their display of their own expertise and the life they lead, because I do believe that Black studies is a lifestyle. It's very difficult to not have it as a lifestyle, but be in the professional setting. And so I think what we've done well is to do our mentorship in a way that endears our students to still go out and welcome other kinds of people to our field of study and to our discipline. So I think we've done that very well in the 50 years. I think from some of its early inceptions on HBCU campuses like Howard and even Clark, and then, making the national travel to SF State and what that meant politically. I think that there's a rap lyric I love. It's by Dom Kennedy. And he says, everything I said last week was the truth. And I think there's another quote, paraphrasing Toni Morrison, we have the moral high ground. I think so many of us have done the work, the research, and it's not easy. In no way, shape, or form, is it easy? And you can be a fan of James Baldwin, or you can be a fan of rap, or you can be a fan of a space, but to do the work and to become the expert is a whole other story. Yeah. And so I think that in the doing the work, in the reaching for the truth and the reasserting of a truth, the truth about our existence here, our life worlds here, and the impact that we make on this society, is endearing and is inviting to precarious students and to young folks and to just students alike, right? I think with the onset of the lockdown of the pandemic, it was a major quake, right? I envision it as a quake, just being a Californian, right? Right, it was a major quake in our field where I saw some of us having the difficulty making the transition into the digital space and being forced to do so, right? Some of our colleagues, Dr. Greg Carr out of Howard University has maintained his YouTube show, teaching, right? So not only on campus, he's in the digital atmosphere with an audience teaching, right? With guests and all of that. Dr. Daniel Black out of Clark Atlanta University did a weekly, essentially spiritual, Afrocentric talk on Facebook Live and on Zoom for free throughout the pandemic, I think for almost a year, right? And so one of my other colleagues went live on IG and really explicated some lesser known Black history facts for months, right? For free, right? On these platforms, because we were in this space where we couldn't go to a library. We couldn't necessarily go to a gallery, and there were no showings and everything was digital. So I think that was one of our major hiccups collectively, is just the forcing of the digitization. Mm-hmm. However, I'm excited about our archival spaces, becoming digitized and being accessible 24 hours a day so that we can have these conversations. Mm-hmm. I'm excited about hybrid courses and online courses, and the move to being a digital Africana, the expansion of being a digital Africana scholar. Like, again, this is one of the manifestations of that as well, right? Because I believe in the, it totally is. Because in the past world, it would be, I'll see you at a conference, or send me some email questions, or fill out an IRB and take the test and wait for approval and do all of this. Yeah. And so I think this is one of those moments where the digitization, us being in this virtual space, is reaffirmed as totally necessary, right? Because I was, thinking about where the university is located, where Portland State University is located, and this being, a very small population of Black folks, and even more so scholarship of Black folks, right? So there's, Washington State, and the universities therein, and Portland, and right, the universities here. But compared to Southern California, compared to Central California, right, we are a very small population. And so with our the society quake that COVID gave us. I think that being able to reach Black scholars in different regions with different areas of expertise is going to be even more integral to welcoming more students, to welcoming more insights and research, even to welcome more correction.
Yeah.
Right. Because I don't think we're above it. I think, there's definitely some things that need to be corrected and unpacked, so to speak, and and done away with.
Yeah,
right?
that's why there need to be jobs for people to be doing that work.
If I had a gavel, I'd bang it. Yes, yes, I totally agree. So that's what I think we could work on. Our digital virtual impact, and not necessarily uniformity, but definitely being accessible and using the tools available. Some of us are really put off by AI. I think AI is the wrong title for the system that we use. I think that's where we have the first hiccup. It's not artificial intelligence. It's a data system.
It will be really, I think, this opens up a whole set of other questions, but just as a signpost there, I think that's where digital studies and Black studies, that intersection is going to produce really interesting insight, because the threats of authoritarian anonymous domination are kind of endemic to the field of study that we share. And so maybe we have some inheritances and historical precedents and so forth. Well, in some ways, maybe you've already addressed this. I wanted to ask this as a last question. I think you've already sort of moved in this direction, but just to put it straightforwardly and see where it takes you, thinking about this from the institution of Black studies, our shared field, what do you think is the thing we should be thinking about? What is the question you think we should be asking that you would want us all to ask that is most urgent?
Who's missing? When you look in your classrooms,
yeah.
When you look in these, indices of some of these texts, who's missing? And I say that because thinking about my own scholarship and the scholarship I see coming after me in Black studies and hip hop studies and literature, who's missing in these stories? Are some of us caught in being commercial, accessible in a way that is palatable, but not I don't want to. You might have to edit this out. I don't want to talk shit on you. Yeah, I don't want to talk too much shit. I really don't. I have strong feelings because I'm in it, but I look up and I'm like, who's missing, right? How can we better welcome the folks who are missing? And the institution has its processes that get on my nerves and that get on folks' nerves. But how can we honor folks' experience when they come sit in front of us, right? I can tell you some stories. I'll tell you one. I had one student, and we were reading some Zora Neale Hurston, some folklore of hers. And they came up to me after class and they were like, oh, so this is a true story. I was like, no. And it was, I think it escapes me right now, but it was alluding to the flying Africans, how the Africans would just fly up off the plantation, right? And so the student remarked, he said, oh, I thought that was a euphemism for, unaliving yourself. I said, no, no, this is folklore. These people really believe that they could, fly and things like that. He was like, oh, I was being really literal. I was like, you were, but you're welcome to, consider it that way. However, that's not what the author was talking about. And that's not generally what Black folks believe to have happened. And so what are we doing with some of the legacies that we're inheriting? What are we doing with even some of the analyses that we're inheriting? And are we looking back at them? Are we reassessing them? How are we talking to students in different disciplines about some of our traditions? And without robbing the author, the intended audience of their, experience of the text of the film or whatever, right? So it's a fine line, and I'm not sure that little anecdote spoke to it, but it was like, what? He just wasn't certain that it just, from what I took from it, and I wrote this in my journal, is that because it was written in the time of enslavement, this person imagined that only option, and that yes, and that in Hurston's recapitulation of a story of a flying African, that was also a capitulation to whiteness, to say they can't even say what they would really do to themselves had they had the autonomy to do so. And if that was the case, yes, they have that, but also it could also be this other thing, and how to help students navigate that, and how to continually navigate that as a professional.
Yeah. And I think, that, who's missing, right? Who's not here is about all, many of the things that you talked about in terms of how do we configure ourselves in relation to different kinds of communities, near and afar, but also this is a problem for all studies of subaltern groups. It's like, how is a voice made present in what we read and how we talk about it, and handling that with care and rigor. But, well, not care and rigor. As you said, rigor is love, with the love that is rigor. So I'm committed to this phrase. I swear to God. But to the rigor that is love, being committed to that question of, are we even able, and are we doing our best to bring what Hurston is talking about, that person missing here? Are we doing our best to bring them in front of us, in front of the classroom? I really love that. It's a wonderful place to wrap up, because I think that gives so much to think about. And, already I'm not going to talk about my own work and classes and stuff, but it has me already thinking about rephrasing some of this stuff. So I love that insight. And that question, I do think we all need to ask, who is missing? Who is missing from today, and who is missing when we study the past? So thank you so much for that, Courtney. This has been fantastic. I really love this conversation.
Thank you so much, John. It's been wonderful for me as well. Thank you for reaching out, and thank you for this platform as well. Again, I think this is one of the ways we do the work. This is one of the ways we show we do the work. This is one of the ways we can invite our students into the work and into how we think about the discipline, and let them know that they can start beginning to think about the discipline as well. Let them know that you've inherited something as well. And the sooner you get to know it, the sooner we can all get to, another level of expansion, another level of liberation, both on the campus and, in the community.
I love that. Yeah. Thank you so much. Really appreciate your time, and doing your part to further this project is really absolutely invaluable. So, and have a great rest of your day.
Same to you. Thanks so much to you and your colleagues for this again. And I'm a fan of the podcast, so I'll be listening. Excellent. And I'll be sharing.
Okay. All right.
Have
Take care. Bye-bye.
Peace.